The fire in Lucius Malfoy's study had burned down to coals, and he had not bothered to call for more wood. He sat at his desk in the east wing of Malfoy Manor, the room dark, except for the red pulse of the embers and the grey light coming in where the curtains had not been fully drawn. Outside, Wiltshire was deep in November. Bare elms, frost on the ironwork gates, the long lawns stripped of their last leaves by a wind that had come down from the north and taken everything it could reach. He could hear nothing of it. The manor's silence was one of its most reliable qualities. It absorbed sound the way a cold stone floor absorbed warmth, completely and without effort. On the desk before him lay a single sheet of parchment. Not a letter. A list. He had drawn it up in his own hand, which was unusual. There were solicitors, secretaries, and any number of clerks who existed precisely to keep his handwriting out of documents. But this was not a document intended for anyone else. This was thinking committed to paper, which was a different matter entirely, and he had wanted no witnesses to the thinking itself. His silver walking cane rested against the arm of his chair, the serpent's head level with his shoulder. He reached past it to adjust the angle of the parchment and did not look at it. 3 weeks since the war had ended. He had been telling himself this in the precise, careful tone one uses to test ice. The Dark Lord is gone. The Dark Lord has been destroyed. The war is over. Not because he doubted the intelligence, which had come from 4 separate channels and was consistent in every particular, but because certainty, like any other resource, benefited from repeated confirmation. He had survived. He had escaped Azkaban risk by means that were somewhat embarrassing in retrospect and entirely effective in result. He had retained the manor, his fortune, his wife, his standing, and his son. His son was, at this hour, asleep somewhere in the upper floors of the house. Draco was not quite 18 months old. He slept with considerable authority. Lucius returned to the list. The war had left vacancies, committee appointments, ministry positions, social offices that had changed hands through death or imprisonment or disgrace. He had reviewed them with the same systematic attention he brought to any significant matter, beginning from the beginning and working through, who had held what, where they were now, and what had therefore been released into availability. He thought of it as an inventory. Power, in his experience, was most usefully understood as a form of real estate. It occupied space, it could be transferred, and where it was left unoccupied long enough, it could be claimed. There were ministry positions emptied by the trials. There were seats on various committees. There were patronage functions that would need new holders. And there were, further along the inventory, Wizengamot-adjacent positions whose prior occupants had been rather dramatically reduced by the preceding several years. Lucius paused. He was aware it was the kind of self-knowledge he had cultivated deliberately, because a man who didn't understand his own position was a man who could be surprised that he himself held none of these. He had no seat on the Wizengamot. Not one. His father had not held one. The Malfoy family's influence on wizarding governance was substantial and real, but it was financial in character, not institutional. It operated through donations, through social relationships, through the carefully timed favor and the well-placed gift. It was influence of the most invisible and therefore most durable kind, and he valued it precisely because it left no formal record. But it was not a vote, and he was entirely clear on the distinction. He had made his peace with this. A lever required no seat of its own. He had spent years moving the people who sat in them, and the outcomes had been satisfactory. He was, however, not without ambition. He moved down to the next entry on the list, the Potter family. James Potter had died on the 31st of October, murdered at Godric's Hollow along with his wife. Lucius held no particular feeling about this. He had encountered Potter twice, had found him precisely what his reputation suggested: reckless, morally uncomplicated, and constitutionally incapable of keeping his opinions to himself. And the man's death had not cost Lucius a night's sleep. What interested him was what the death had left behind. The heir was alive. Harry James Potter, approximately 16 months old, placed with Muggle relatives in a Surrey suburb that had been, for all practical purposes, made invisible. Lucius had heard this from 3 separate sources in as many days, and all 3 had said the same thing. The address was not in circulation. Dumbledore had seen to that, and Dumbledore's sightlines were longer than most people cared to acknowledge. The boy was unreachable. That was a fact to be noted and set aside. The seat, however, was another matter. Under the provisions of ancient house law, provisions which were, in this particular application, genuinely exploitable, the Potter family's Wizengamot seat was legally unoccupied. No proxy had been named. There was no wizarding custodian standing in trust during the heir's minority. The heir was an infant in a Muggle household whose residents almost certainly did not know what a Wizengamot was, let alone that their charge held a claim to sit in one. The seat stood empty, the way a contested estate stands empty, while the solicitors argue, and the heirs are still too young to speak for themselves, full of potential, accumulating nothing but legal dust. Lucius sat with that for a moment. He was aware that Sirius Black had been the obvious candidate for any wizarding guardianship role, Potter's godfather, the natural choice in the absence of the parents. But Black was in Azkaban, arrested in the immediate chaos that followed the Dark Lord's fall, and nothing Lucius had heard suggested he would be leaving Azkaban at any point that mattered to the present question. He allowed himself a brief, cool acknowledgement of this. The most natural opposing force to any claim on the Potter name had been removed before Lucius had even thought to make one. He noted the convenience without dwelling on it. Dwelling was not how he operated. The question, then, was the horizon. The boy would enter the wizarding world at 11. That was the fixed point, immovable, as reliable as September the 1st. July 31st, 1991. The moment Harry Potter received his Hogwarts letter, people would begin explaining things to him. His inheritance, his identity, and eventually, if someone thought to mention it, the political standing of his family's name. The window was the decade between now and that day. Once the window closed, the legal situation became considerably more complicated. 10 years was sufficient. He would not start from nothing. He had the manor and the vault. He had Narcissa, who understood the architecture of these things without requiring explanation. He had Draco, 17 months old and asleep upstairs, for whom this was not abstract ambition, but practical inheritance. A world in which the Malfoy name occupied space commensurate with what it was owed. He would need to think carefully about the Hogwarts Board of Governors. He had been intending to involve himself more formally for some time, and now there was cause that went beyond the general. And there was the question of which alliances within the ministry would prove most useful as the post-war order settled, and who might eventually be moved, through patience and the proper applications of resource, to look with sympathy on a matter of ancient house law. He would need to be careful. Dumbledore would be watching. That was simply the nature of Dumbledore, who collected information the way other men collected debts, and any move Lucius made would need to be precisely calibrated. Not concealed. Legal. Everything that was about to begin would need to be entirely and demonstrably legal, because he had no intention of giving the Chief Warlock grounds to act, and because a man with genuinely clean hands was, in the long run, considerably more powerful than a man who merely had something to hide. He did not write any of this on the parchment. The parchment was the inventory. The plans would live in his head, where they were considerably safer. He set down his quill. The fire had gone fully dark. There was only the grey winter light at the window and the manor's deep silence around him, and somewhere above him, his son breathing quietly in the dark. Lucius looked at the list for a long moment, then folded it once, precisely, and placed it in the locked compartment of his desk. Not destroyed. Filed. He settled back in his chair and watched the cold light strengthen slowly through the curtains, patient as the house itself, and thought about 10 years, and what a methodical man could make them contain. The room cost 3 sickles a night, which was at the outer limit of what Remus Lupin could currently manage. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in a rented room in Islington, one of the boarding houses that took both Muggle and Wizarding tenants without asking many questions about either, with his coat still on because he had not been able to get warm since November began, and November had begun badly. The room held a bed, a nightstand, a grate with no coal in it, and a window that faced the wall of the building behind. He had been here for 2 weeks. He had a cardboard box under the bed that contained everything he currently owned, which was not much, and had not been much even before October. He had prematurely greying light brown hair that needed cutting, a face that looked a decade older than 21, and scars along his jaw and cheek that were pale enough to overlook if you were not looking. He was 21 years old. He was, at this moment, the last of the marauders who was both free and alive, which was a sentence he could hold in his mind without quite being able to feel the full weight of it. He kept approaching it from different angles, the way you probe a bruise to discover whether it has healed, and finding that it hurt exactly the same way from all of them. James was dead. That was the one he had to start with every time, because it was the one that reorganized everything else. James Potter, who had been irritating and brilliant and loyal to the point of stupidity, who had once transfigured himself into a stag in the middle of a ministry corridor just because Lupin had dared him to, was dead. His wife was dead. Lily Evans, who had been the only person Remus had ever known to argue James into genuine silence, who had been so precisely and bracingly herself that it had sometimes felt difficult to breathe in her vicinity, was dead as well. They had been 21 years old. Lupin kept noticing this, the way you notice a splinter, repeatedly, uselessly, each time like the first. And then there was Peter. Peter Pettigrew was dead. He had died on the 1st of November, on a street in London, because Sirius Black had found him and done something that left 12 Muggles dead and Peter in pieces and Sirius laughing in the rubble. This was what Lupin had been told. This was what every newspaper had printed, what every conversation in every wizarding establishment had covered in obsessive detail for 3 weeks. He had read the accounts. He had read them more than once. He could not make the numbers work. He had known Peter since they were 11. He had spent 7 years in the same dormitory, made the same collective decision to become animagi, so that one of their number would not have to face full moon nights alone. He had known Peter's particular variety of fear, the smallness of it, the way it sent him toward the nearest large hand, and the man described in the accounts was not a man he could locate in that knowledge. That was the specific, immovable problem that sat in the middle of every account he read and refused to move. Remus stopped. Set the thought aside. He was not capable of thinking clearly about Sirius. He was not capable of thinking about Sirius in the same way he was not capable of pressing a hand against a wound that had not closed, not because it would hurt more, but because doing so would reveal things about its depth that he was not ready to know. He stood up, put on his scarf, and went out. The Ministry of Magic's public entrance was a telephone box in Westminster, which Lupin reached by a combination of bus and more walking, arriving slightly before noon with a face that made the Muggle commuters around him step slightly aside. He was aware he looked terrible. He had been aware of this for several weeks and had not found the capacity to address it. His coat was 6 years old and the cuffs were starting to fray. He needed a haircut. He was, by any reasonable assessment, a young man who looked considerably older than 21, which was perhaps not surprising given what the preceding month had contained. The woman at the Wizengamot Administration Services desk had the particular quality of manner specific to ministry officials who had been dealing with very large problems and were now dealing with members of the public, which was considerably less large and considerably less interesting. She looked at him the way she had probably looked at 40 people before him that morning. He explained what he wanted, information about the date of Sirius Black's trial. She looked at him, then at her files. Then she told him there was no trial scheduled for Sirius Black. He said carefully that he understood there might be delays, and that he was simply asking for the current status of the proceedings. She told him, more carefully, that there were no proceedings, that the matter had been handled through the office of the head of magical law enforcement, that Black had been remanded to Azkaban directly, that no Wizengamot session had been convened for the case. Lupin stood on the other side of her desk for a moment. He asked whether there was a process by which he could request that proceedings be initiated. She told him there was not, in the current circumstances, a mechanism for third parties without formal standing to compel a trial review. He asked what formal standing meant in this context. She told him it meant family members, legal representatives, or named guardians. He was none of these things. He thanked her and walked back to the telephone box and stood inside it for considerably longer than was necessary before pressing the button and returning to the street. He had known, in some general sense, that the wizarding world was moving quickly in the aftermath of the war, that the trials were rushed, that people were frightened, that the head of magical law enforcement had been given broad powers and had used them broadly. He had believed, somewhere in the part of himself that had grown up regarding the ministry as a functioning institution, that mechanisms existed for the correction of injustice. He had not known, specifically, that approximate justice in a post-war period meant this: that a man could be sent to Azkaban for the remainder of his life without the Wizengamot ever being convened at all. He turned this over in his mind on the bus back to Islington, and could not find a surface of it that was not sharp. He could not file a petition. He had no standing. He could not demand access to Harry. He was not Harry's family, and he had not been named as guardian, and Dumbledore had not told him where Harry was in any case, which was itself a fact Lupin had been living alongside for 3 weeks without knowing how to hold it. He knew Harry was alive. It was in every paper, every conversation. The boy who lived, 1 year old, somewhere safe. Somewhere. Dumbledore had presumably arranged all of it, and had not thought to tell Remus, and Lupin was in the slow process of deciding whether that constituted protection or abandonment, and finding that the distinction had become considerably harder to locate than he would have expected. He let himself back into the room in Islington. The grate was still cold. The box was still under the bed. Outside, the other building's wall occupied the same position it had always occupied. He sat down on the edge of the mattress and did the accounting again, because he did it every day, because he could not seem to stop. James, Lily, Peter, Sirius. He did not know about the empty seat in the Wizengamot. He did not know that in Wiltshire a man named Lucius Malfoy was at that moment compiling a careful list of everything the war had left unattended. He only knew that the world he had grown up in was gone, and that the last living piece of it was a boy a little over a year old, in a place Lupin could not find, held by people who almost certainly did not know what they were holding. He sat with that for a long time, in the cold room. There was nothing else to do. By February, the petition had been drafted, reviewed, revised, and reviewed once more. Lucius had not written a word of it himself. He had engaged a firm of wizarding solicitors whose senior partner owed him 3 different favors in 3 different registers, and the resulting document was, by every measure he had applied to it, exactly what it needed to be: precise, internally consistent, and entirely unobjectionable on any ground except the one it was designed to advance. The language of ancient house law did not lend itself to brevity, which was partly why the process had taken until February, and partly why the finished document ran to 11 pages of dense parchment that Lucius had read once, carefully, in the morning light of his study, while his silver snake-headed walking cane rested against the arm of his chair, and somewhere further in the manor, Draco made small authoritative sounds that suggested he had woken up. The argument was straightforward enough beneath the language. Harry James Potter, not yet 2 years of age, was the heir to the most ancient and noble house of Potter, and therefore the rightful occupant of the Potter family's Wizengamot seat. He was a minor. He had no designated wizarding proxy. The seat therefore sat vacant in the institutional sense, not inherited, not in stewardship, simply empty, while its heir existed somewhere in Muggle England, without, presumably, anyone having seen fit to explain to him what a Wizengamot seat was. Under the provisions of ancient house law, any head of house, meeting the relevant criteria of standing and lineage, could petition the Wizengamot to hold such a seat in stewardship until the heir came of age. The Malfoy family, as a most ancient and noble house, in good standing with no outstanding legal impediment against the current head, met all applicable criteria. Lucius set the document down on the stack, called for his solicitor, and instructed him to file it. The petition arrived at the Wizengamot Administration Services Office in the 2nd week of February. It was logged, assigned a case reference, and forwarded through the relevant procedural channels with the efficient disinterest that the Ministry reserved for work that was administrative rather than urgent. The then Minister for Magic signed the filing acknowledgement as protocol required. From there, the petition moved through the offices of the Wizengamot's clerical secretariat, and eventually into the pile of documents awaiting the attention of the Chief Warlock. It arrived at Hogwarts on a grey Thursday in the 3rd week of February. Albus Dumbledore had been headmaster of Hogwarts for 23 years, and Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot for rather longer than that. In both capacities, he had developed a reliable instinct for documents that required his full attention before he had finished reading the first paragraph. The petition from the Malfoy solicitors required his full attention before he had reached the end of the case reference. He was sitting at the large desk in the headmaster's study, where the portraits of previous headmasters lined the walls and mostly pretended to be asleep, and the lake was visible through the window as a flat grey sheet under February cloud. He was a tall man, thin in the way that very old people sometimes were, with an extraordinarily long silver beard and silver hair that fell past his shoulders, and had at some point stopped requiring comment from anyone who knew him. His half-moon spectacles caught the light as he tilted the parchment. His nose had been broken in his 20s, and had settled at a slight angle it had maintained ever since. His eyes, behind the spectacles, were a piercing blue that tended to produce in the people he fixed them upon the distinct impression that he had already read the document they were holding, and was simply waiting for them to catch up. He read the petition twice, not because the first reading had been unclear, but because precision mattered in this particular case, and he wished to be entirely certain that the document said exactly what he thought it said. It did. He sat for a time in the quiet of the study, letting the problem resolve itself into its parts. The stewardship provision of ancient house law was not widely known. It predated the statute of secrecy and had survived into the present day in a form that was rarely invoked, because the situation it was designed to address had rarely arisen. Lucius Malfoy had clearly made a particular study of it, or had employed someone who had. The argument was not without legal foundation. That was the first and most uncomfortable fact he had to acknowledge. The second was the motivation behind the filing. Lucius did not pursue avenues that offered no meaningful prospect of success. This petition was, on one level, a legal document. On another, it was a declaration of intent, an announcement that Lucius had identified the seat, had identified that Harry could not occupy or defend it, and had decided that the decade between now and Harry's 11th birthday was the appropriate window in which to act. The filing itself was not the danger. The persistence was the danger. The counter-argument, at least, was not difficult to locate. Petunia Dursley, née Evans, was Harry Potter's legal guardian, under both Muggle and Wizarding law, as Dumbledore himself had arranged. The relevant precedent was clear. Guardianship of a minor's person extended in the first instance to guardianship of that minor's legal interests and institutional standing until the ward came of age. Petunia Dursley therefore already held Harry's rights in trust. The petition was premature on its face. Dumbledore wrote the counter-response himself. He filed it the same afternoon. He sat with the second problem for rather longer after the filing had been sent. The argument he had made was sound, but it rested on an assumption that Wizarding law had never been specifically required to examine, because the situation it described had not previously existed. Whether the guardianship rights of a Muggle extended to the wizarding institutional rights of a wizard heir was a question the ancient texts didn't address, and current jurisprudence hadn't resolved. Petunia Dursley's authority over Harry as a person was entirely clear. Her authority to exercise a wizarding political right on Harry's behalf. That was the grey area. He knew it was a grey area. He was reasonably confident that Lucius Malfoy would find it. The counter-response reached Malfoy Manor in the first week of March. Lucius read it at his desk, in the same chair, with the same walking cane resting against the arm of it. He read it once, set it down, and looked at the window. He had expected Dumbledore to find something. What he had found was, structurally speaking, a wall. Well constructed, correctly sourced, presented with the authority of a man who had been doing this for 60 years. The wall was real. Lucius did not dispute it. But a Muggle woman's authority over a wizard heir's wizarding institutional rights was not a settled point of law. That was not stated anywhere in the counter-response, which was precisely the interesting thing. It was not established in any current legal text. It was the place where the argument was thinnest. Not a crack, not yet, but a seam. And every wall built in haste from materials that were nearly, but not entirely, right eventually revealed where the seam was. He replaced the counter-response in its envelope and set it aside. Outside the window, the grounds of Malfoy Manor were still brown and bare in the last of the winter light, the long lawns running toward the tree line under a sky the color of old pewter. He would have an answer to this. The answer required the right question, asked in the right proceeding, before the right audience. He was quite good at finding the right question. He had 10 years. That was sufficient. The fire in the headmaster's study had settled to a steady burn, and Dumbledore had not moved from his chair in some time. Outside, mid-December had closed its grip on the castle. The mountains were dark by 4 o'clock. The grounds below the window were frost-white, the lake invisible under low cloud, and the corridors carried the quieter sounds of a Hogwarts reduced to its holiday population. He was not reading. He had correspondence on the desk that had not been attended to. He was sitting with his hands folded, and the firelight reflected in his half-moon spectacles, thinking about Petunia Dursley. The knock was Minerva McGonagall's. 3 precise raps, evenly spaced, conveying neither impatience nor softness. "Come in, Minerva." She entered in tartan robes, with her black hair pulled back, and her expression settled into the composed reserve she had maintained, Dumbledore thought, since approximately 1956. She settled in the chair across from his desk and set her hands on the knees of her robes with the economy of long practice. She looked at him, the way she sometimes looked at students who had produced a perfectly correct answer to the wrong question, attentive and not entirely satisfied. "The Malfoy petition," she said. "I've been thinking about it." "So have I. The counter-response holds for now. He hasn't withdrawn." "He won't withdraw," Dumbledore said. "He is waiting for a better moment." She had been present, 11 months before, on the steps of a house in Privet Drive, in the small hours of November 1st. She had spent the day before that in animagus form, watching the household, the long-necked woman, the large husband, the pristine small street that tried very hard to have nothing unusual happen on it. She had come to him afterwards on a street corner and told him precisely what she thought. She thought it still. He knew this because she had not stopped thinking it, and she was not the sort of person who changed her mind about facts simply because the decision had been made. "He will grow up not knowing," she said, "what he is owed, what belongs to him." "Yes. And the seat will sit empty in his name for a decade, and Lucius Malfoy's petition will age in the administration services files, and when Harry is 11, none of it will have been resolved." "It will have been deferred," Dumbledore said, "which is not the same thing. Close enough from where I'm standing." He was quiet for a moment. She waited with the patience she had developed over many years of waiting for Dumbledore to finish thinking. "The problem," he said at last, "is custodianship." He laid it out carefully. Harry's guardianship under Muggle law was properly Petunia Dursley's, established, documented in both Muggle and Wizarding channels, not in legal doubt. Petunia could direct Harry's education, his residence, his daily life. What she could not do, what the law had never been required to answer, was exercise a wizarding institutional right on a wizard heir's behalf. The Potter seat was a political and magical office. Petunia Dursley was a Muggle who did not know it existed. Lucius's solicitors would eventually stand before the Wizengamot and argue that her guardianship did not extend to it, and they would not be entirely wrong. "That's the crack he identified in February," McGonagall said. "It is. I bought time. I did not resolve the underlying problem." "Then resolve it. Name a wizarding custodian for Harry's institutional rights. Someone with standing. Someone who can hold the proxy during his minority and challenge the petition directly." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "That is the obvious solution." She waited. "The intended custodian was Sirius Black," he said. "James and Lily named him Harry's godfather, the formal designation under Wizarding convention. If Sirius were free, he would hold Harry's proxy rights by that designation alone. He would be the natural opponent to Lucius's claim, and he would prevail. He is not free." "He is not," McGonagall said, with the particular neutrality of someone who had complex opinions about this that she was setting aside for the moment. And to formally name another custodian, in any wizarding legal context, would require Harry's name to appear in records, searchable records, records that Lucius's firm is already almost certainly monitoring. He set his hands flat on the desk. "The blood protection requires that Harry remain at Privet Drive. It requires that his existence there not become known to those who might wish him harm. The Dark Lord is gone. He will not remain gone permanently. I am not willing to act as if he will. There are people who would benefit enormously from knowing precisely where Harry Potter lives, and a formal custodianship filing in wizarding legal records would be discoverable by anyone with sufficient motivation and the right ministry contacts. Lucius Malfoy has both. McGonagall was very still for a moment. Then, "You are keeping Harry invisible to protect him from his enemies. And his invisibility is precisely the legal opportunity Lucius is using against him. Yes, you cannot solve both." No. The fire shifted. Neither of them spoke. "You've chosen the Blood Ward," she said. "I've chosen his life. A Wizengamot seat can be defended by other means, in time. A 2-year-old child cannot be undone." He let this sit between them. "The Petunia argument must hold as long as it can. I am looking for a counter that does not require Harry's address in the wizarding public record. And when you find one—" He did not answer immediately. He was thinking, as he had been thinking for several months now, about a small irregularity in the circumstances of Sirius's imprisonment. Sirius had been sent to Azkaban on the authority of the then head of magical law enforcement. The Wizengamot had not been convened. There had been no trial, no hearing, no court proceeding of any kind. This meant that Sirius Black's legal status as Harry's intended guardian had never been formally revoked. It had been interrupted by Azkaban, by the chaos and grief of the 1st of November, by a wizarding world that had needed someone to blame and had found one with a speed that did not allow for process, but not dissolved. A guardianship designation that had never been legally dissolved could not, in principle, be transferred to a third party. Lucius's argument required that no adequate wizarding proxy existed, but if Sirius's proxy designation remained legally extant, Lucius's argument collapsed. The difficulty was that making this argument required standing before the Wizengamot and establishing, as a matter of record, that Sirius had received no trial and that his guardianship had therefore never properly lapsed. This was true. He could make it. He was not certain yet what it would cost. He would need a witness, someone with direct personal knowledge of the original designation, someone who had been present when James and Lily named Sirius, who could attest without possibility of contradiction that the designation had been made and that it had never been legally dissolved. There was one such person. Remus Lupin was 31 years old and had not heard from Albus Dumbledore since November of 1981. There were reasons for this that Dumbledore continued to find sound. Not yet, he thought. He was not ready yet. The argument was not ready. He did not say any of this to McGonagall. He told her instead that he needed more time and that the counter-argument existed, and that it would be ready when it needed to be. She studied him for a moment, with the assessment of a person who has learned to distinguish between genuine confidence and the performance of it, and who has spent enough years with Albus Dumbledore to know which this was. She stood, straightened her robes, and bid him good evening. The study was very quiet after she left. He poured himself a cup of tea. The pot was still warm on the corner of the desk, and sat with it for a while in the firelight and the December silence. Below the window, the grounds were still. The lake, invisible under its covering of cloud, held its cold water in the dark. In a house in Surrey, a child 2 years old was sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs. He did not know what he was. He did not know that a man in Wiltshire had spent 11 months building a legal case around his name, or that the man in this chair had spent 11 months trying to decide how to counter it without giving away the address where the child slept. He was 2. These things were not his problem yet. Dumbledore drank his tea and thought about Sirius Black's legal record, and about a werewolf in London with prematurely greying hair who did not yet know he would be needed, and about how much could change in a decade if a person were sufficiently careful. He had approximately 9 years. He would begin. The grounds of Hogwarts in April held a quality of light that Lucius would not have described as beautiful, and found striking anyway. The mountains were still white at their peaks, but the lawns had come back to green, and the lake caught the afternoon sun in a way that was disproportionate to any body of water that had any business being in Scotland. He had walked up from the gates at a pace that communicated he was not in a hurry, which was the only pace worth maintaining if one wished to be interpreted correctly. He had attended Hogwarts. Everyone attended Hogwarts. But the castle looked different when you approached it as a prospective Board of Governors member, rather than as a student, in the same way that a house looks different when you are assessing whether to acquire it than it did when you merely lived in it. He was seeing it as infrastructure now. He was evaluating it. His walking cane, silver, snake-headed, the polished elm catching the light with each step, tapped against the path at an unhurried interval. He was approximately 30 years old. He wore robes of deep grey with silver fastenings, which was what he wore when he wished to convey seriousness without appearing to try for it. He had recently made a donation to the school's library renovation fund at a level of generosity that he felt communicated the appropriate level of interest. He had not made it out of concern for the library. The meeting lasted 2 hours. He sat with 2 current board members and the school's administrative council in a room off the deputy headmistress's corridor, and he let them lead. Letting other people lead a conversation cost him nothing, and gave him the advantage of observing who finished the others' sentences, who glanced at the window when asked a difficult question, who responded to a specific number with the slight forward lean of a person for whom the number had been unexpectedly large. By the time he walked back down toward the gates in the late afternoon, he had identified whose support would be straightforward to acquire, whose principle would make them expensive, and where the gap in the board's oversight structure was that he intended to eventually correct by occupying it. He had also confirmed what he had already suspected. The board had no formal authority over the headmaster on questions of curriculum, student admission, or educational emphasis. Dumbledore had arranged this over decades with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understood that the best defense against interference was to appear to have already accommodated it. The structure was elegant. Lucius intended to dismantle it methodically from the inside. He was patient. The Wizengamot petition remained blocked. 2 years now. The Petunia counter-argument, holding without resolving anything, as provisional arguments were designed to do. He did not consider this a defeat. He considered it an interval. The board was the second strategy, and he had set out its value to himself with the same systematic clarity he brought to anything that mattered. If the Wizengamot route eventually produced results, if the crack in the Petunia argument could be found, if a more sympathetic minister eventually arrived, if time and persistence outlasted Dumbledore's procedural patience, the political seat was its own reward. A vote in Wizarding Parliament, the prestige of holding what the Potters had held, the institutional weight his family had never formally possessed. But if the Wizengamot route failed or consumed the full decade, the board still offered something arguably more durable. Harry Potter would arrive at Hogwarts in September of 1991. Whoever shaped Hogwarts in the years between now and then shaped the world Harry would enter when he arrived. The curriculum he would study, the values the school would model, the relationships of authority and patronage that would govern his understanding of the wizarding world before he was old enough to form his own. All of this flowed through the institution, and the institution was governed by its board. Lucius was going to be on the board, He was going to be, in time, its chair. There was also the question of principle, which he turned over in private with more regularity than most people would have assumed. The Potter seat had been held by wizards of ancient lineage. The Potters themselves were pure blood. The line was legitimate, whatever one thought of James Potter's politics or his apparent conviction that the wizarding world was improved by being told his opinions of it. The seat was a wizard's seat, and the heir who stood to claim it was the son of Lily Evans, who had been Muggle-born, who had chosen her allegiances with what Lucius considered an impressive lack of proportion, and who had died in a house in Godric's Hollow, apparently convinced that her obligations to her own kind were secondary to whatever she had decided to believe instead. He did not hate Lily Potter. She was dead. What he felt when he thought of her was the particular irritation of someone identifying a structural error that had been allowed to persist until it produced a predictable consequence. A seat of ancient wizarding heritage, passed through generations who understood what that heritage meant, was on course to become the inheritance of a child who was half of what it required. This was not a matter of feeling. It was a matter of order. He was correcting a misalignment. He had framed it to himself precisely this way and found the framing useful. The board work moved steadily across the following 2 years. He attended every meeting, which gave him a detailed map of every procedural weak point in the body's governance. He made further donations to the Quidditch pitch, to the potions laboratory, to a fund for students of appropriate breeding whose families had suffered during the war. He entertained board members at Malfoy Manor with the precision of a host who understood that generosity was a form of obligation that people didn't always notice they were incurring until they had already agreed to repay it. By the end of 1985, he was a full board member. By the middle of 1986, 3 of the others deferred to him before they deferred to the chair. He had not yet moved against the chair. The timing was not right. It was an October evening in 1986 when he found Draco in the West Gallery of the Manor, sitting on the floor in his nightclothes with a book of wizarding pictures open across his lap. Draco was 6 years old. He had pale blonde hair and a fine-boned face, and the concentrated expression of a person who was not yet ready to admit he was tired. He looked up when Lucius appeared in the doorway, with the specific expression of a child, aware that sitting on the floor of the West Gallery at this hour was not technically forbidden, but was probably not encouraged. Lucius sat down on the bench beside him and looked at the pictures. An old wizarding family in a house he didn't recognize, the painted figures nodding in the perpetual courtesy of portrait subjects. Draco pointed at something and asked about the robes. He noticed details. He had always noticed details. "When you go to school," Lucius said after a while, "it will be the best school in Britain, and the world you go to school in will be a world your family helped make." Draco considered this with the solemnity of a 6-year-old processing a large statement. Helped make how? By being present, by not leaving important things to other people. Lucius paused. By understanding what belongs to us and what has been left unattended, and the difference between the two. Draco was quiet for a moment. The painted figures moved their painted hands in their painted room. "Will I meet Harry Potter at school?" Lucius looked at his son. He had mentioned the name in this house only in contexts he had not expected a 6-year-old to register. He should have known better. Draco listened with the patience of someone who understood already that adult conversations contained more than adults believed they were sharing. "Yes," he said. "You will." "Is he our enemy?" Lucius considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. His son was 6, and was asking with the directness of a child who had already absorbed enough of the household's atmosphere to understand that something was being pursued here, that the study and the papers and the visits to Hogwarts were all aimed at a particular point. "He is a matter that requires attention," Lucius said. "That is not the same thing." He raised his hand and smoothed the pale hair back from his son's forehead, unhurried, the way he did nothing else. "But he is not your concern yet. Go to sleep." Draco looked at him for a moment with those pale eyes, and then closed the picture book. He had time. The chapter was not finished, but the first part of it was written. It was enough. The dungeons kept their own season. Whatever was happening at the surface of the grounds, whatever green thing the calendar was insisting on, down here it remained the cool and constant damp of a space that had not received direct sunlight in 800 years, and Severus Snape had inhabited it long enough to have stopped registering it in any useful way, the way one eventually stopped registering the persistent smell of potions' ingredients or the specific weight of an oath made under duress. It was simply the condition of the place. He had chosen to live in it. He had chosen to live in it because it suited him, and because the things that suited him were not, generally, comfortable ones. He had been potions master for 4 years, having taken the position at 21. He was 25 now. He had spent those 4 years becoming someone who could be in a room with the people he had previously been in rooms with for different reasons, and who could do it without the different reasons being visible. He was good at it. He had been good at it since before he needed to be. He had returned from the Crab dinner 2 hours ago. He had spent 4 hours in a drawing room in Wiltshire, being sufficiently agreeable to a table of people who shared the wordless understanding that certain topics from the early part of the decade were not raised in polite company. He had eaten their food and drunk their wine and listened with the patience of someone appearing to be barely doing so. He was not barely listening. Social occasions in post-war Slytherin circles were, for anyone paying the right kind of attention, intelligence briefings. He had, in the course of those 4 hours, added 3 pieces to a picture that had been assembling itself across several months. The picture had been building since late 1984, from fragments gathered at separate events. A spring dinner, a summer party, a winter gathering of people who managed their shared history by eating together in expensive rooms. Taken individually, none of the fragments was remarkable. Lucius Malfoy attending Hogwarts Board of Governors meetings. Lucius making well-publicized donations to the school's infrastructure renovation. Lucius, at a dinner the previous spring, saying something slightly too offhand about the current minister's succession that had caused the man beside him to laugh with the specific quality of someone who has just heard the outlines of a plan and recognized them. The laugh of an audience. The laugh of people who have been told what is coming without being told when. The petition was the other piece. Lucius had filed in early 1982 a claim to hold the Potter family's Wizengamot seat in stewardship during the heir's minority. Snape had heard this from the Parkinsons in late 1984 and had spent several months tracing it through channels that had no particular reason to be inaccurate on the subject. The petition had been blocked. It had not been withdrawn. These were 2 separate facts, and it was important to keep them separate. A blocked claim was not a resolved one. What all of it assembled into was a portrait of someone running 2 concurrent strategies with patience and methodical clarity. An institutional route. The Wizengamot seat, suspended but not abandoned, waiting for a minister who would look on the matter with greater sympathy than the current one. And a structural route. The Board of Governors, where Lucius was embedding himself with the slow thoroughness of someone who understood that influence established over years was considerably more durable than influence applied in an afternoon. The convergence point was a boy 7 years old in Surrey, living in a Muggle household, who would walk through the doors of this school in September of 1991 with no knowledge of either strategy. Snape climbed from the dungeons just after midnight, when the corridors were quiet enough that his presence attracted no particular attention. Students had long since learned not to remark on his movements after dark. It was part of the established ecology of the castle, like the Peeves-free zones in the East Wing and the warmth differential between the 7th floor and the 6th. The gargoyle moved aside without warmth. The spiral staircase rose. The study was lit. Dumbledore was at his desk and did not appear to be surprised that Snape was at the door, which also was part of the ecology. Dumbledore was never surprised. He gestured to the chair across from him. Snape did not take it. He delivered reports standing, which was his preference, because it reminded both parties of the essential nature of the exchange. He covered the Wizengamot petition, the board membership, and the implied ministerial expectation in approximately 6 minutes, without elaboration, beyond what the facts required. Dumbledore listened with the stillness he brought to things that concerned him, not the placid stillness of someone who was not alarmed, but the deliberate stillness of someone managing their alarm precisely. His silver beard lay against the desk. His half-moon spectacles caught the lamp. His eyes, behind the spectacles, did not move from Snape's face. When Snape finished, 10 seconds passed. All of this is confirmed? The petition through Administration Services filing records. The board positions a public record. The ministerial inference is exactly that. Inference from a pattern of observed behavior. I consider it reliable. Yes, Dumbledore said. So do I. A pause. Thank you, Severus. Snape said nothing. He turned and took the staircase back down. The stairs descended with the unhurried efficiency of enchanted objects that had performed one function for centuries and saw no reason to revisit the decision. Snape descended with them and did not look at the portraits, which were awake and watchful in the way portraits became at this hour, with the particular attentiveness they gave to people whose histories were interesting. He was not interested in being found interesting. He was protecting Harry Potter. He was walking down a moving staircase at midnight, having spent 4 hours at a dinner he found tedious in order to gather information he had just spent 6 minutes delivering, and the purpose of the whole architecture was to protect a 7-year-old boy in a Surrey suburb, who did not know that his name was generating filings in the Wizengamot Administration Services office, or that a man in the dungeons of Hogwarts was attending Slytherin dinners on his behalf. The boy didn't know his name meant anything at all. He was 7. The boy had his mother's eyes. Snape knew this from what people had said in the weeks following Godric's Hollow. Bright green, unmistakably lilies, the one feature that had survived intact. He had not seen the boy. He did not intend to until the boy arrived in his class, at which point it would be unavoidable. He was not doing this for the boy. He was doing it because Lily Evans had been the only person in his life whose intelligence had matched her decency, and who had chosen, with full knowledge of who he was and who he was becoming, to stop choosing him, which was a decision that had been correct, and which he had been living with for the better part of a decade, and which he did not intend to revisit in a castle stairwell on a Tuesday night. He was doing it because when Lily died, he had understood the nature of what he owed, and had made a promise in terms that admitted of no ambiguity, and he intended to keep it with the same precision he brought to everything that mattered. Not warmth, precision. There was a distinction, and he held to it. The staircase reached the bottom. He walked back through the dungeons, and the torches threw his shadow long and black across the stone, and he did not think about Lily Evans any further that night, because he was practiced at the management of this particular thought, and because the dungeons were cold. In the headmaster's study, Dumbledore sat for some time after the report. The Board of Governors presented no avenue for intervention. Lucius had done nothing improper. Every donation was legitimate, every meeting attended, every vote correctly recorded. He had built a position inside Hogwarts governance without a single procedural flaw, and acting against him would require either finding one or creating circumstances that generated one, and neither of these was something Dumbledore was prepared to do on the basis of an intention, however clearly read. But the timeline had moved. 2 fronts, where before there had been one. A petition, suspended rather than resolved, and an institutional position that grew stronger each term. The next formal hearing would come with different conditions than the last. He sat with a blank sheet of parchment. He thought about a man in Azkaban imprisoned without trial, about the guardianship designation that had never therefore been legally revoked, about the witnesses who could speak to that fact under the right conditions. He had perhaps 2 years. He would use them. The Wizengamot chamber was not large for something that governed the entirety of a magical society. Lucius had expected more from it. The tiered seating accommodated 50-odd members in plum-colored robes embroidered with a silver W, arranged in the ranked arrangement of seniority that the body had presumably been using since before anyone currently occupying the seats had joined it. The torches along the walls threw the silver thread into relief. In the innermost positions, where the oldest members sat, the plum robes were thin at the elbows, in a way that suggested their occupants had been in these seats through a considerable number of proceedings. He himself was not in plum robes. He sat at the petitioner's table, which was positioned lower than the member seating and angled, he noticed, so that anyone seated at it was obliged to look slightly upward at the body. A small architectural choice, not accidental. His silver walking stick rested on the table before him, its snake's head pointing toward the chamber. He had not placed it thoughtlessly. At the chamber's center, above the assembled body, Albus Dumbledore occupied the Chief Warlock's seat with the specific composure of a man who had presided over enough proceedings to no longer need to perform the act of presiding. The long silver beard, the half-moon spectacles, the crooked nose at a slight angle it had presumably had for decades. He was watching the room with the patient attention he brought to things he considered important, which, in Lucius's experience of him, was most things. Lucius began. He had prepared the argument over months, with the assistance of 3 legal advisers, and had delivered versions of it in the library at the manor until the language had become his own. This freed him, during the delivery, to watch the room. He read the chamber as he read any room, by the quality of attention from each section, by who looked down at documents and who looked up. He made 3 points. The first, Harry James Potter, heir to the most ancient and noble house of Potter, was a minor with no designated wizarding proxy. The Potter family's Wizengamot seat stood unoccupied in the institutional sense, not inherited, not in stewardship, simply absent any holder of the heir's political rights during his minority. The second, the person who would naturally have served in this capacity, Sirius Black, named godfather and intended guardian, was imprisoned and therefore unable to act. The seat's natural proxy was unavailable. The third, the Malfoy family, as a most ancient and noble house in good standing, with no outstanding legal impediment against its current head, met all applicable criteria under ancient house stewardship law to petition to hold the seat during the heir's minority. The petition was properly filed, properly documented, and entirely in order. He sat. The silence that followed was not the silence of a body that had just heard something that surprised it. The members had read the documents. They were considering, Lucius thought, whether the man who had filed them would be as difficult in person as the filing had been on paper. He watched the oldest members in the innermost seats, those with the longest institutional memory and the most studied stillness, and read their attention as he had read it throughout, present, following the argument, not committed. Not yet. Dumbledore spoke. Petunia Dursley, née Evans, was Harry Potter's legal guardian under both Muggle and Wizarding law. This was properly established, properly documented in both legal systems, and not in any active dispute. Under Wizarding guardianship precedent, custodianship of a minor's person extended, in the first instance, to custodianship of that minor's institutional rights and political standing during minority. Petunia Dursley therefore already held Harry Potter's institutional rights in proxy. The petition was premature on its face. A valid and active legal guardianship was extant, and a stewardship claim required the absence of one. He delivered this without inflection and without hurry. Lucius stood. He said, "Petunia Dursley was a Muggle. She did not know what a Wizengamot was. She could not attend a session of this body, could not cast a vote in it, could not, in any practical sense, exercise a wizarding political right on behalf of a wizard heir." The precedent Dumbledore had cited governed guardianship of the person. It had never been applied to a situation where the guardian was a non-magical individual, and the right in question was specifically wizarding and institutional in character. The question of whether a Muggle's guardianship extended to the exercise of wizarding political rights was not established in wizarding law. He was not asking the Wizengamot to overturn existing precedent. He was asking it to acknowledge that no precedent applied here, and that this absence created precisely the vacancy that stewardship law existed to fill. He sat. Dumbledore made a procedural argument. The petition before the body asked the Wizengamot to affirm that wizarding proxy law required a non-Muggle designee in these specific circumstances. This was a request to establish new precedent, not to apply existing one. The petition did not cite sufficient existing authority to justify establishing it. The appropriate course was to deny the petition as unripe and leave the question of Muggle guardian scope for a proceeding more specifically designed to settle the relevant legal standard. He did not argue that Petunia Dursley's authority was unlimited. He argued only that the absence of a clear limit was not, in itself, grounds to award stewardship to a third party whose petition rested on asserting that limit existed. Narrow, Lucius thought, specifically calibrated. A man who was not defending a position, but buying time in which to build one. The vote was taken. 22 members voted to grant stewardship. 28 voted to deny. Lucius noted the margin. 22 was not a negligible number, nearly half the body, the outcome turning not on the weakness of his case, but on the procedural authority of the chair and the institutional caution of the oldest members in the innermost seats. Their resistance to claims that had not been fully litigated was real. It was not personal. Without prejudice. The words appeared in the formal ruling that was read into the record moments later. The petition was denied without prejudice, with leave to refile. Without prejudice meant that the question was open. Without prejudice meant that the next petition would arrive with this proceeding as its foundation, rather than starting from nothing. Without prejudice was, Lucius had always thought, a phrase that told you more about the confidence of the body using it than about the merits of what was being denied. He rose, gathered his walking stick, and left the chamber without looking at anyone directly. Not from anger, which was not what he was feeling. From the measured understanding that faces in moments of outcome were read and remembered, and that his face should convey nothing beyond the composed expectation of an ancient house that had heard a procedural objection and was already considering the response to it. Minerva McGonagall met Dumbledore in the corridor outside the chamber, while the last of the plum robes were filing past. She was 52 years old. She had watched the proceedings from the section reserved for Hogwarts staff in their institutional capacity, with her arms folded and her expression conveying, to anyone who knew how to read it, the particular quality of attention she brought to situations in which she had correctly predicted the outcome and was less than satisfied by it. "How long does the denial hold?" she said. The corridor was emptying around them. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how precisely to be honest. "Until Lucius finds a minister whose administration views the petition differently than the current one," he said. "The ministerial authority over Wizengamot petition review has limits, but it is real. A minister who chose to signal sympathy with this claim would change the conditions under which the next petition is heard considerably." "The next ministerial succession?" she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "You bought time." "We bought time," he said. "We were not going to win the question today. The question is not winnable today." He turned toward the corridor that led back to the entrance. "We bought time, and we must use it. That is what I have." She fell into step beside him, and they walked, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that the corridor ahead of them was 9 years shorter than it had been when this began, and that the margin in the chamber had been 22 to 28, and that margins moved. Number 4, Privet Drive, was, in the opinion of the street around it, a perfectly ordinary house. It had clean net curtains and a well-kept front garden and a brass door number that had never been allowed to tarnish. It had a family that behaved in all the expected ways. The husband left at 8 and returned at 6. The wife maintained the garden and attended the neighborhood watch meetings with the committed energy of someone who had decided that community standards were one of the few things still under her control. It had, in the cupboard under the stairs, a boy of 8 who was not part of any of this. Harry Potter was small for his age, thin in a way that drew adult attention, and was then carefully not remarked upon, with black hair that had no productive relationship with gravity, or combs and a pair of bright green eyes that sometimes made people look twice without being able to say why. There was a scar on his forehead in the shape of a lightning bolt. He had always had it. When he was very small, he had asked about the scar, and been told about a car crash, and had believed this for a while, and then believed it less completely, and had eventually filed it alongside the other things he had learned it was more comfortable not to pursue. The summer routine at number 4 was consistent. He was given tasks in the garden each morning, and he did them, and this was considered adequate for the purposes of breakfast. Petunia Dursley was tall and thin, with a very long neck and a long face, and large eyes, and a mouth that had, in Harry's experience of it, approximately 17 distinct configurations that conveyed information without requiring the production of actual words. She handed him the weeding gloves, too big for his hands, worn at the fingertips, and pointed at the left side of the front border and went back inside. He put the gloves on and began working. The left side of the front border was where she always started him, because the rose bush was on the right side, and she had specific feelings about who was allowed near the rose bush. He liked the garden. He had given up analyzing why. Outside was preferable to inside on a number of grounds that he had stopped listing. Something happened that August that was typical of the kind of thing that sometimes happened to him. He was working near the end of the border, the trowel at an awkward angle when it slipped. It should have knocked against the pathstone and bounced. Instead, there was a pause, brief, like a skipped breath, and the trowel settled itself upright in the soil at a tidy angle, as though a careful hand had intervened between the slip and the fall. He looked at the trowel. He looked at the house. Petunia was standing at the kitchen window. He picked up the trowel and continued working. He heard the back door open and close. He heard Petunia go somewhere in the house and come back. She did not come outside. She did not say anything at dinner. She pressed her mouth into its tightest configuration, the one he had learned to read as something has just happened that I have decided not to acknowledge, and looked at her plate, and the subject did not arise. It never arose. That was the consistent part. What Harry thought about, mostly, was school, specifically the social geometry of it, which required a level of daily navigation that occupied more mental space than the actual lessons. Dudley, large, blonde, occupying the other bedroom and a permanent orbit of admiring friends, had a social territory that Harry had mapped with some precision, knowing which corridors and corners to avoid and at what times. He was not afraid of Dudley, he told himself. He was strategic. The distinction mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. In the afternoons, when the weeding was done and there was nothing else assigned to him, he sat at the edge of the garden near the fence and thought about things in the loose, unanchored way of someone who had a lot of time alone. He thought about what teachers meant when they wrote things like unusual on his report cards, and whether unusual was the same thing as strange, and whether strange was the same thing as whatever the Dursleys meant when they looked at him in that particular way that indicated they were thinking about something they had decided not to say. Strange things happened around him. He had known this for as long as he could remember. A glass of water would slide an inch on the table without being touched. He would wake up on a roof. He would think very hard about wanting something, and the thing would, sometimes, be where he needed it. He had no language for any of this. He had never heard the word magic used about anything that was real. He only knew that it happened, and that the Dursleys were frightened of it in a way that existed underneath every interaction they had with him, like the hum of something buried in the walls. There was also the thing he sometimes knew before it happened. It was always small. He would round a corner and know, before he saw anything, that Vernon was in a particular kind of mood. He would start down the stairs in the morning and understand, with the quiet certainty of a thermometer reading, that today was a day to be quiet and take up less space than usual. He was right often enough about this that he had stopped noticing he was doing it and had started simply doing it. It was just a sense he had. He didn't know if other people had it. He had no way to ask. He knew that the Dursleys were more frightened of him than they had any obvious reason to be. He had understood this from a young age without being able to explain it to himself. It was in the way Petunia looked away when the trowel caught itself. It was in the way Vernon sometimes watched him across the dinner table with an expression that was not exactly anger and not exactly something else, that was more like vigilance, the look of someone monitoring a situation they expected to get worse. Petunia had a letter she kept in the back of the wardrobe in the master bedroom. He did not know this with certainty. He suspected it with the same wordless accuracy with which he anticipated Vernon's moods. He had been perhaps 5 years old the morning she had come down the stairs with her mouth in that configuration, the tight one, the one that meant something irrevocable had occurred, and gone about the rest of the day with the contained, careful movement of a person who was carrying something they were not going to put down. He had never seen the letter. He didn't know what was in it. He knew it existed the way he knew other things, without being able to explain the knowing. On a Saturday evening in September, he ate the dinner that had been given him, and washed his plate, and climbed the cupboard stairs, and pulled the door shut, and lay on the cot in the familiar dark, and listened to the television through the wall. The cupboard had a low ceiling. He knew exactly how to navigate. It had a shelf with his things on it. He'd had it to himself since before he could remember having things to himself. and it had a quality he couldn't name. It was his in the way that nothing else in the house was. He did not know that in a large house in Wiltshire, a man with pale platinum hair and a silver-headed walking cane had spent the past 7 years building legal arguments around his name, treating him as a position to be occupied, a seat to be claimed before its rightful owner was old enough to claim it himself. He did not know that in a school in Scotland, a man with a silver beard and half-moon spectacles had spent those same 7 years deciding how to answer those arguments, buying time, waiting for the right legal tool to arrive. He did not know that his name generated filings in a building in London whose existence he was entirely unaware of, or that a court he had never heard of had voted, by 22 to 28, on a question about who got to represent him in a world he didn't know he belonged to. He was 8 years old. He was in his cupboard in September. He had avoided Dudley's friends all afternoon without incident, and he had not made anything happen in front of Petunia since the trowel, and this constituted a good week. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep. The announcement appeared in the Daily Prophet on a Wednesday morning in July, and Lucius read it with the specific quality of attention one gave to something that had been expected for a long time and had therefore arrived as confirmation rather than news. The outgoing Minister for Magic, who had held the office for close to a decade, and had been, for most of that decade, the principal structural reason that a certain petition in the Wizengamot Administration Services files had not progressed, had retired. In her place, Cornelius Fudge. The Prophet's editorial was enthusiastic. The editorial board evidently found Fudge reassuring in the specific way that people found moderate men reassuring when they had recently been living through immoderate years. Lucius set the paper down. He poured himself a cup of tea. He allowed himself approximately 30 seconds of quiet satisfaction, and then he called for his solicitor. He had known Fudge for 11 years. They had first met in 1979 at a ministry function. Fudge was a mid-level official in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, working his way upward in the unhurried manner of a man who had decided that competence and the right social connections would eventually produce results if given enough time to compound. He had been right about this. He had also, from very early in their acquaintance, been someone that Lucius understood how to manage. What Lucius had understood about Cornelius Fudge was that he was not, in the deepest sense, a political animal. He was a social animal who had drifted into politics the way amiable and reasonably capable men sometimes did, because his colleagues had told him he should, because it came with forms of recognition he found genuinely satisfying, and because he was not constitutionally inclined to argue with favorable assessments of his abilities. Lucius was, by every relevant measure, exactly the right person. He had made this clear through careful, consistent action over a decade. The donations to ministry initiatives that Fudge had championed, the invitations to Malfoy Manor extended with precisely the frequency that communicated welcome without suggesting need, the public support expressed at exactly the moments when public support was most useful to be expressed. He remembered one dinner in particular, perhaps 4 years ago, Fudge and his wife at the manor, the specific pleasure Fudge had taken in being treated as a man whose judgment was sought, rather than merely as an official whose approval was being purchased. Lucius understood this distinction, and had behaved accordingly. It had taken 11 years. It had been worth 11 years. The solicitor arrived at the manor on Thursday. The petition itself required minimal revision. The legal argument was the same it had been in 1987, and the 1987 hearing had established enough framework that the new filing could position itself as a continuation rather than a new proceeding, which was strategically preferable. The Wizengamot had denied the petition without prejudice. Without prejudice was an invitation, and Lucius had spent 3 years preparing to accept it. What had changed was not the argument, but the context in which it was being heard. The covering letter to the Wizengamot Administration Services Office was drafted at Lucius's specific direction in language that made certain implications available to those who were positioned to read them. It cited the procedural record of the 1987 hearing. It noted the changed administrative environment without specifying the nature of the change. It did not name the new minister. It did not need to. The signal was in the positioning, in the timing, in the phrasing, in the tone of a letter from a solicitor who had clearly been told something his client had not seen fit to write down. Fudge had not explicitly endorsed the petition. That would have been too visible, and Fudge, whatever his other qualities, had a reliable instinct for what would survive scrutiny. What he had done at a ministry reception in June was say something carefully casual to a senior official about the importance of reviewing long-standing petitions with fresh eyes when a new administration took office. The remark could be explained as administrative enthusiasm. It was understood as an instruction. Lucius had not been at the reception. He had heard about it from someone who had been and who understood the register in which these things were communicated. He allowed himself to feel something very close to genuine satisfaction. Then he had the letter sent. In the headmaster's study at Hogwarts, the petition arrived with the first week of August post. Dumbledore read it twice, which was not because the first reading had missed anything, but because the document required 2 different kinds of attention. The first to establish what it said, the second to establish what it meant. He was approximately 109 years old. The half-moon spectacles sat on the crooked nose. The long silver hair and beard lay against his desk. Outside the window, the summer grounds were green and still, and the lake caught the afternoon light with the equanimity of a thing that had existed long enough to have no opinion about ministerial successions. He sat with the petition for some time. McGonagall came in that afternoon without knocking, which was her prerogative of long standing, and looked at his face with the accuracy of someone who had been reading it since before half the current Wizengamot members had been born, and was quiet for a moment. "The minister," she said. "Yes." "You said, until he found a minister who agreed with him." "I did." He set the petition on the desk. 1 year, Minerva, approximately. Harry turns 11 on July 31st, 1991. The final hearing will come before that. Lucius will make certain of it. He looked at his hands. "I need the serious argument, and I need it ready, and I need Lupin." She looked at him. "You're going to contact him?" "I am going to contact him." He paused. "When the time is right." She did not ask when that was. She had learned that when Dumbledore said, "when the time is right," he generally meant when the argument was ready, which was not the same as when it was needed. "It holds," she said. "The serious argument." "It must," he said. "There isn't another one." Draco was 10 years old and had recently begun practicing being 15. Lucius watched him from the doorway of the drawing room that evening, his son standing at the far window, with the considered posture of someone who had decided the window required watching, addressing some imaginary inferior in the low, even voice he had apparently been cultivating. He was pale-haired and pointed-faced, and had the Malfoy manner in its earliest form, still being actively constructed, the arrogance visible as effort rather than reflex. By 15 it would be reflexive. At 10 it was still something he was building deliberately, which was the more interesting stage. Narcissa was at the other end of the room, not watching and nonetheless aware. She had her own sense of what Draco required. Lucius crossed the room and stood beside his son at the window. Draco looked up. The front drive lay in the long light of the July evening, the gates at the far end standing closed. "Next year," Lucius said. Yes, Draco said. He understood what was meant. He had been prepared for next year for most of his available life, in the accumulated way that children absorbed the expectations of the household they grew up in, through years of presence at the dinner table, and overhearing conversations not quite intended for him, and the osmotic process by which a child who paid attention came to understand what his family was working toward. "You will meet Harry Potter," Lucius said. Draco's expression shifted, not surprise, which Lucius had expected, but the specific quality of attention that meant he was taking something seriously. "I know. He will know nothing. He will arrive knowing nothing of the wizarding world, of his own history, of what his name means and to whom. He will be starting from the very beginning." He paused. "You will not be. That is the difference between you." Draco looked out at the drive. He was 10. He could not fully understand what was at stake in the year ahead. But he could understand advantage. He had been raised in this house. "Yes," he said again. It was enough. Lucius looked out at the grounds, the lawns in the fading light, the dark line of trees at the perimeter, and thought about the year that remained. The Board of Governors at his direction, the petition refiled with the minister's implied weight behind it. The hearing to come, which would be different from 1987 in the way that all things were different when the political environment had shifted. He had been building toward this for nearly 10 years, and the closer the horizon came, the more clearly one could see what lay on the other side of it. 1 year. He would use it carefully. The letter took Dumbledore 3 drafts to compose, which was unusual. He had developed, over a very long life, a facility with correspondence that generally did not require revision. The difficulty with this letter was not the words themselves, but their quantity. He was writing to a man he had not contacted in 9 years, asking him to do something that would cost him something, in a situation the man did not know existed. The letter needed to explain enough to make the request intelligible without so much that it felt like a summons. He was also conscious that 9 years of silence carried its own weight, and that Lupin was in a position to draw accurate conclusions from it. There was no way to address this in 4 paragraphs. He addressed only what he could. The final version was brief. He sealed it and sent it with an owl, and sat for a time in the headmaster's study, with the fire burning, and the portraits pretending to be asleep, and the specific quality of silence that follows a decision made too late, but not so late as to be useless. He was in Leeds when the owl found him, which was not where he had expected to be that spring, but spring had sent him where the work was. He was working for a Muggle building firm that asked no questions he would have had to answer carefully, which was the primary criterion he had been applying to employment for the better part of a decade. He was 31 years old, with prematurely greying light brown hair, and a face that registered as older than it was, scars along his jaw and cheek, shabby clothes. The owl appeared on his windowsill at 6 in the morning on a Thursday in April. He recognized the handwriting on the envelope before he broke the seal. He sat down on the edge of the bed. The room in Leeds was functional and temporary, like all the rooms since Islington, and read the letter. He read it again. James and Lily had been dead for 9.5 years. Sirius had been in Azkaban for 9.5 years without a trial, which was a fact Lupin had deposited in the part of his mind reserved for things he could not affect, and had therefore learned to carry rather than address. Harry would turn 11 on the 31st of July. He was somewhere in the Muggle world, at an address Lupin had spent 9.5 years not being told. Albus Dumbledore was writing to tell him there was something that needed doing, that he was suited to do it, that his specific knowledge mattered. He looked at the window. The Leeds morning was the grey-brown of early spring. He wrote back that he would come. He arrived at Hogwarts on a Saturday afternoon in late April, coming through the main gates on foot with the attention of someone encountering a place they had not visited in over a decade. The grounds were the same. The lake, the towers, the forbidden forest at the far ridge. The castle with the quality it had always had of being permanently, indifferently itself, without interest in what had happened in the years since he had last seen it. The headmaster's study smelled of something sweet. The portraits were awake and watching. Dumbledore was standing when Lupin entered, which he noted and did not comment on. "Remus," Dumbledore said, "thank you for coming. 9 years is a long time to keep someone uninformed." He said it without heat. He had arrived at something that was not quite forgiveness and was more than resentment. "Tell me what's happening." Dumbledore told him everything. The petition in 1982, the decade of blocks and renewals, each provisional, each buying time rather than resolving the question. The Petunia argument and its structural limitation. Petunia was Harry's guardian as a person, but whether a Muggle's guardianship extended to a wizard, heirs wizarding institutional rights, was a question wizarding law had never been required to answer. Lucius's Board of Governors position, built over years by donation and presents, the arrival of Fudge in 1990, and what it meant for the political conditions around the final hearing. He told it in order, without editorializing. When he finished, there was a silence. "He's been doing this for 9 years, Lupin said. "Yes. And Harry doesn't know. Harry knows nothing of his identity in the wizarding world. That was a decision I made for his safety. I have been living with its consequences for 9 years, and I am aware of what those consequences include." It was not quite an apology. It was what Dumbledore could offer, which Lupin had come to understand was not nothing. "What do you need from me?" "Sirius Black was imprisoned without trial," Dumbledore said, "on the authority of the then head of magical law enforcement. No Wizengamot proceeding was ever convened. No court issued a ruling. His legal status as Harry's designated guardian, named formally by James and Lily Potter before their deaths, was never therefore formally revoked." He paused. "A guardianship designation that has never been legally revoked cannot be superseded by a third-party stewardship claim. The Potter seat cannot be awarded in stewardship, while Sirius Black's designation remains legally extant. And it remains legally extant because no court has ever dissolved it." Lupin was quiet for a moment, working through it. "You need someone to testify that James and Lily made the designation, and that Sirius was never tried. I need someone with direct personal knowledge of both facts, who was present at the designation, who attended the ministry themselves seeking information about a trial and was told that no trial would be held." He met Lupin's eyes. "You went to the ministry in November 1981. I was turned away. I had no standing." "You had no standing to compel a proceeding," Dumbledore said carefully. "That is a different thing from what I am asking. You are not filing a petition. You are not acting independently. I am asking you to testify as a witness at the Chief Warlock's invitation, which is an entirely different structural position. The authority is mine, and you are providing knowledge that only you hold." He paused to let this settle. 3 facts: that James and Lily formally designated Sirius as Harry's godfather and intended guardian, that you were present, and that you attended the Ministry of Magic in November 1981 and were informed that no trial had been or would be scheduled. Lupin looked at him. "You're not arguing that Sirius is innocent?" "We are not litigating the murder charge at all. We are arguing that Sirius's legal designation as Harry's intended guardian was never dissolved through any formal proceeding, and that until it is, the seat cannot be awarded to a third party. And if the Wizengamot decides that Azkaban constitutes sufficient resolution, then we lose, and I will not have another argument." He did not say this as a confession. He said it as a fact that both of them needed to understand before they went further. "I want you to know the limits of what I'm asking." Lupin was quiet for a moment. He understood the limits. He also understood the other thing, that a werewolf appearing before the Wizengamot to give testimony on behalf of Sirius Black's legal status was not a comfortable position in any direction. The wizarding world's opinion of werewolves had not improved in 9 years. Its opinion of Sirius Black had not improved at all. He would be standing in that chamber as the intersection of two unpopular things. He understood this. "I'll testify," he said. Dumbledore looked at him with the attention of a man who was neither surprised nor relieved, which was the most honest thing about him. He did not perform the emotions he hadn't been experiencing. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. And that was enough. Lupin walked out of the study and down the moving staircase and through the corridor below, and the castle moved around him with the cool indifference it had always had, and he walked until he reached the main doors and stood looking out over the grounds. The lake in the late April light, the mountains, the long lawns with the new green just coming up. He was 31 years old. He had been carrying November 1981 for 9.5 years, without anywhere to put it down. The weight of James and Lily and Sirius and Harry, through rented rooms and odd jobs and managed monthly miseries, and had never been asked to make any of it mean something. He had been asked now. It was not justice. It would not free Sirius, would not give Harry his parents back, would accomplish only a delay if it went right, and nothing if it went wrong. But it required the specific knowledge he held, knowledge no one else held in quite the same way, and it was directed toward a child who was 10 years old and living in a muggle house without knowing his own name. He stood at the doors for a while in the April light, and felt the weight rearrange itself from something being carried to something being used. That was enough. He would go home, he would prepare his testimony, he would come back, and he would stand up, and he would speak. The Wizengamot chamber, assembled from the outside, in, by seniority, in silence. The plum-coloured robes of 50-odd members settled into the tiered seating, the silver W embroidered in each, catching the torchlight as the body arranged itself in order. In the innermost positions, the oldest serving members occupied the seats they had held through a considerable number of proceedings, and watched the chamber fill with the patient attention of people who were not easily surprised by what happened in it. Lucius Malfoy arrived at the petitioner's table and sat. He was approximately 37 years old, platinum blonde and grey-eyed, his bearing the composed distance of a man who understood that composure was the form wealth took when it wanted to be taken seriously. His silver snake-headed walking stick rested against the table, its head pointing toward the chamber. Remus Lupin arrived at the witness position. He was 31, prematurely greying, with scars along his jaw and cheek, and the shabby clothes of someone who had no better. He sat, and he did not look at Lucius Malfoy, and Lucius Malfoy did not look at him. Dumbledore was already at the Chief Warlock's chair. His silver beard lay against his chest. His half-moon spectacles sat on the crooked nose. His eyes, behind the spectacles, were a piercing blue that moved between the parties with the steady attention of someone who had been presiding over things for a very long time, and who had opinions about this particular proceeding that the role of presiding prevented him from expressing. The senior members of the body, Those with the institutional memory and principle to resist political pressure watched. Lucius spoke first. A decade had refined the argument rather than softened it. He did not revisit the Petunia counter-argument, which the 1987 hearing had effectively settled. The body was not going to sustain indefinitely the position that Muggle guardianship extended to a wizard heir's wizarding institutional rights. That point was functionally conceded. He was not here to relitigate it. What remained was simpler. Harry James Potter would turn 11 on the 31st of July. Weeks from now, the Potter family's Wizengamot seat had stood unoccupied for 10 years. Its heir had no wizarding proxy. The intended guardian, Sirius Black, was in Azkaban, serving a life sentence for murder. The petition had been pending for 9 years. The heir was about to enter the wizarding world, and this was the last clean opportunity to establish orderly stewardship, while the question remained a matter of law rather than the boy's own volition. He sat. The chief warlock called the witness. Lupin stood. He was aware of what he was in this room, a werewolf in a formal chamber of wizarding law, giving testimony on behalf of a man the wizarding world considered a murderer. He was aware that the faces in the plum robes were watching him with expressions that ranged from neutral to the specific blankness of people who had already decided what they thought. He had prepared the testimony by writing it until the words were his own, and then putting the paper away. He attested to 3 facts from direct personal knowledge. First, James and Lily Potter had formally designated Sirius Black as Harry Potter's godfather and intended guardian before their deaths. It had been a deliberate designation, made in full awareness of the circumstances that might require it to be invoked. Second, he had been present when this designation was made. Third, in November 1981, he had attended the Ministry of Magic seeking information about Sirius Black's trial date. He had been informed by the Wizengamot Administration Services Office that no trial had been scheduled, that no trial would be held, and that the matter had been resolved through the authority of the then head of magical law enforcement without a Wizengamot proceeding of any kind. He sat. The silence that followed was the silence of a room that had heard something it could not dismiss and had not yet decided whether it wanted to acknowledge it. Dumbledore's formal position, when he delivered it, had the economy of something pared to exactly what it needed to be. Sirius Black's status as Harry Potter's intended guardian had never been legally terminated. No trial had been held. No court had issued a ruling. No Wizengamot proceeding had been convened. The guardianship designation, made formally by James and Lily Potter and attested to by a direct witness under oath, remained legally extant because no legal process had dissolved it. A guardianship designation that was legally extant could not be transferred to a third party. The Potter seat's proxy could not be awarded while that designation remained in force, and it would remain in force until a court dissolved it. No court had done so. Lucius stood. The Azkaban sentence, he said, constituted de facto resolution of Sirius Black's legal status. The man was imprisoned for murder. The imprisoning authority was a competent ministry official acting within his authority. The practical effect of a life sentence was indistinguishable from the legal dissolution of any right the imprisoned person might otherwise hold. To argue that Sirius Black retained guardianship rights because no formal proceeding had dissolved them was to argue that procedure should override reality. Dumbledore looked at him across the chamber. De facto, he said, is not de jure. The ministry's authority to imprison is not the same as a court's authority to dissolve a legal designation. One can be fully competent to do the former without having been empowered to do the latter. The designation stands until a court dissolves it. No court has. The Wizengamot recessed. When the body returned, the chief warlock read the ruling. By a narrow majority, the Wizengamot ruled. The Potter seat was to be held in abeyance. It would not be awarded in stewardship to the petitioner. It would not be assigned to any custodian. It would remain vacant and unresolved until Harry James Potter reached the age of majority or appeared before the Wizengamot in person to address the question of his own representation. In abeyance. Lucius absorbed this from the petitioner's table with the stillness he had been cultivating for 10 years. He had not won. He had also not been definitively closed off. In abeyance meant the question was open. It would be open when Harry Potter walked through the doors of Hogwarts in September. Open when the boy was eventually told what he held and what it meant. Harry was 11 years old and knew nothing. Nothing of the seat, nothing of the decade of legal work done in his name, nothing of Lucius Malfoy or what he had been attempting for the entirety of Harry's remembered life. The moment Harry entered the wizarding world, the game did not end. It reset on new ground, with new conditions, and some of those conditions, the board among them, had been prepared very carefully over a long time. He left without expression. Lupin remained in the witness position for a moment after the members had begun to move. He had done the 3 things he had come to do. Spoken the 3 facts he held from direct personal knowledge in the room where they mattered. It was a procedural argument rather than a question of justice. It had not freed Sirius, had not given Harry anything he could touch. But the ruling was what it was because of what he had said. He had been a person whose specific knowledge was needed, and he had provided it, and the outcome had been shaped by the provision of it. He stood and gathered his coat and walked out of the chamber into the corridor. The weight of November 1981, the decade of rented rooms and odd jobs and managed monthly miseries, the long years of carrying what had happened without anywhere to put it, had rearranged itself in some way he could not fully name. It was not justice. It was not relief. It was something closer to the satisfaction of having been present, specifically and usefully, at a moment that required him. He had been asked. He had come. That was enough. Dumbledore sat in the Chief Warlock's chair after the chamber had emptied. The ruling was what the law required. He had made the argument correctly, and the law had produced the result it was capable of producing. But in abeyance was not protection. It was a pause. The question would come back the moment Harry entered the wizarding world. Harry did not know the question existed. He did not know about the seat, or the petition, or the decade of legal argument conducted around his absence. He did not know his own name in the wizarding world. Dumbledore rose and gathered his robes. He had weeks before the first letter, before the world opened for Harry Potter, and everything in it became immediately more complicated. The next task was not legal, but personal, and it was the hardest one left. He would need to reach Harry before Lucius could, and Harry would need to know his own name before someone else told it to him. The 31st of July was a Thursday, and no one at number 4, Privet Drive, remarked upon it. It was not a house that accommodated sentimentality in any direction, and the specific sentimentality of birthdays, cake, candles, the deliberate marking of another year in the life of someone you loved, had never, in Harry's experience of it, extended to him. Dudley's birthdays were different. Dudley's birthdays were considerable productions involving presents stacked in the hallway and a particular kind of fuss in the kitchen that Harry was not invited to participate in, except in the capacity of dishwashing afterward. Harry's birthdays were ordinary days that happened on July 31st, and July 31st, 1991, was an ordinary day. He was 11 years old. He did not particularly feel 11, which was the same way he had felt about every birthday he could remember. The number changed, and the house did not. The morning was clear and warm, and Petunia had sent him to the back garden by 8 o'clock to deadhead the roses along the fence, a task that required both the small garden shears and the specific form of attention that meant not cutting anything he was not meant to cut, which was most things. Harry applied himself to this with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been maintaining other people's gardens for most of his available life. The roses were in good shape. He had kept them in good shape all summer. He was on the 3rd section of fence when he heard it. Owls did not, as a rule, deliver post in the daytime. Harry knew this because he had, on various occasions, watched the ordinary owls that came to the neighborhood at dusk, the ones that lived in the belt of trees at the far edge of the playing field. This was not that kind of owl. It was large and white and moving through the mid-morning light with the specific directness of something that knew exactly where it was going, and where it was going was the back garden of number 4, Privet Drive, and specifically toward him. It landed on the fence post 3 sections ahead of him and held out its leg. There was a letter tied to it. Harry looked at the owl. The owl looked at Harry with enormous amber eyes that held the expression of something that had delivered a great many letters and found the people it delivered them to consistently underwhelming. He took the letter. The envelope was heavy, heavier than he expected, made of something that felt like very good paper, thick and cream-colored and slightly formal in his hand. He turned it over. The address on the front had been written in an emerald green ink that had not smudged at all despite the journey. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He read this 3 times. He had never received a letter before. He had received, now that he considered it, which he was doing very carefully because his heart was behaving strangely, nothing addressed specifically to him. Nothing that knew his name and his exact location, including the part of the location that was the cupboard under the stairs. The Dursleys received post. Dudley received packages. Harry received the knowledge, general and ambient, that post existed, that it went to people who were the kind of people things were sent to. This was addressed to him. Someone, somewhere, had written Mr. H. Potter and known exactly where to find him. He turned the envelope over. The seal on the back was a circle of purple wax, impressed with a coat of arms he did not recognize, a lion, an eagle, a badger, a snake, each in a quadrant. Below them, a banner with words he couldn't read from the angle he was holding it. He had his thumb at the seal when the kitchen door opened. Petunia stepped into the garden with a look on her face that, in his experience of her many faces, he had never seen before. It was not the tight-lipped configuration of a woman who had decided something unacceptable had occurred and was choosing to address it through controlled silence. It was not the look she wore when he did something wrong, or when she suspected he was about to do something wrong. It was the color it was. The color of old milk, of something that had been left out too long, and her large eyes had gone very wide. She reached out her hand. He pulled the letter back. He did not plan to pull it back. His hand did it before he had decided to. They looked at each other over the envelope in a way that Harry understood was different from the ordinary way they looked at each other, which was usually across some intermediate zone of managed indifference. This was direct. She was looking at the letter and at him, and something in her face told him that she knew what it was, and had known what it was going to be, and had been thinking, for some number of years, about how to handle it when it arrived. She had not handled it yet. She was standing in her garden with her hand out, and her face the color of old milk. He did not let go of the letter. She closed her hand. She put it by her side. She looked at him for another moment, with the expression that was not any of her usual configurations, that was something underneath all of them. and then she went back inside without a word. He stood in the garden with the letter in his hand. He had understood something, in the 3 or 4 seconds of looking at her face, that he was still turning over. She had not been angry. She had not been managing a situation or containing something unacceptable. She had been frightened in the way. He knew this from years of accurate reading. That meant the thing was real, not the daily low-grade wariness she had always directed at him, which was more like permanent suspicion. This was something older. He thought about the letter she kept in the back of the wardrobe, the one he had never seen and had been certain about for as long as he could remember. He thought about the things she had never told him and the way she didn't tell them, the quality of the not telling, the specific shape of it, the careful maintenance of something that had been sealed a long time ago. He looked at the wax crest on the envelope, a lion, an eagle, a badger, a snake. He had not opened the letter. He was going to. In a large house in Wiltshire, a man with platinum blonde hair and cold grey eyes had spent 10 years, beginning from the month this same boy had been placed in a muggle suburb he did not know existed, filing petitions in a court the boy had never heard of, building a legal argument around a name the boy didn't know anyone cared about. He had not won the decade's specific objective. The seat had been denied him. The question was held in abeyance, open, unresolved, waiting. The boy was 11. He was about to enter the wizarding world. And in Wiltshire, in a west-facing gallery of that large house, a pale-haired 11-year-old with the Malfoy manor still visibly under construction was 3 weeks away from his own Hogwarts letter. He had been prepared. He knew the forms of address, the hierarchy of houses, the social architecture of the school both of them were about to enter. He was 11 years old, and had been told, in terms appropriate to 11, what the next decade was going to require. He would not be the only person at Hogwarts who knew what Harry Potter's name meant in a court of law. In the headmaster's study at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore was approximately 110 years old, and he was standing at the window with a cup of tea he had not yet drunk. He knew the day. He had known this day for 10 years. He had been counting down to it the way you counted, toward something that was both necessary and weighted, with things that could not be undone. The death of a woman with bright green eyes, the choice to place a child in a suburb where his enemies could not reach him, the decade of legal maneuvering conducted in his name without his knowledge. He thought of Lily. He thought of her the way he thought of the dead he had loved, which was carefully, with the specific care of someone who had been carrying the thought for a long time and knew how to carry it without letting it pull him off course. She had died so that her son could live. The boy had lived. He was 11 today. He was holding a letter that bore the name of a school she would have delighted to send him to. The seat in the Wizengamot that bore James Potter's name would not trouble Harry today. It would not be the first thing he learned, or the second, or perhaps even the 10th. There was so much the boy needed to know, that the list had its own architecture, its own order of necessity. Today was about the letter, about the first crack in the world the Dursleys had built around him. Below him, somewhere across England, in a small back garden, a boy with black hair and his mother's eyes, and a lightning bolt scar he had never been given a satisfactory explanation for, was holding the first letter anyone had ever sent him. He drank his tea. That was enough.